The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, a town where the smell of leather, sweat, and prejudice hung heavy in the air. It was 1892, and the frontier was still raw, still bleeding from old wounds that refused to heal. Ayanna moved carefully through the back alleys, her long black hair braided with traditional beads that caught the harsh sunlight. At 17, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of her Apache heritage, but her dark eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned too young that the world could be cruel to those who looked different. She had come to town to trade herbs and medicines her grandmother had taught her to make, remedies that had saved white settlers' lives more times than they cared to remember. But gratitude had a short memory in Copper Ridge. "Look what we got here," sneered Jake Morrison, the blacksmith's son, as he stepped out from behind the general store. His friends, 3 young men with too much time and too little sense, flanked him like a pack of wolves. An Indian girl, walking around like she owns the place. Ayanna's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm just passing through. I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Jake laughed, the sound harsh as grinding metal. "You being here is trouble, girl. This is a white man's town." The other men circled closer, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden sidewalks, and Ayanna noticed how the few people on the street suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Shop doors clicked shut, window curtains twitched closed. "Please," Ayanna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll leave. I was just—" Jake's calloused hand shot out and grabbed her braid. "You'll leave when I say you leave." The pain was instant and sharp as he yanked her head back. Ayanna stumbled, her medicine bag spilling its contents across the dusty street, precious herbs and roots scattering like broken dreams. "Look at all this witch doctor nonsense," one of the other men jeered, crushing a carefully prepared healing poultice under his boot. From the shadows of the saloon across the street, a figure watched. He was tall, lean, with weathered hands that rested calmly on the bar. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, missed nothing. He had been in town for 3 days, speaking to no one, asking for nothing but a room and a stable for his horse. The locals called him the Quiet One. He paid for his drinks in silver coins and never caused trouble. But something about him made even the roughest men in town give him space. Now, as Jake Morrison dragged Ayanna by her hair toward the main street, those pale eyes followed every movement. "Let's show this town what happens to Indians who forget their place," Jake snarled, his grip tightening in Ayanna's hair. The young Apache woman fought back tears as she was dragged through the dust, her knees scraping against the rough ground. The humiliation burned worse than the physical pain. She could hear windows opening now, people coming out to watch the spectacle. "Stop!" she gasped, but her voice was lost in the jeers of Jake's friends. The quiet cowboy set down his whiskey glass with deliberate slowness. His spurs chimed softly as he walked toward the saloon doors, each step measured and purposeful. Outside, the crowd was growing. Men emerged from shops and saloons drawn by the commotion. Some looked uncomfortable, but none moved to intervene. This was just another day in Copper Ridge, another reminder of the unspoken rules that kept everyone in their place. Ayanna's traditional dress tore as she was dragged over the wooden planks of the sidewalk. Her hair, once braided with care by her grandmother's gentle hands, was now a tangled mess in Jake's cruel grip. "This is what happens," Jake announced to the gathering crowd, "when savages think they can walk among decent folk." The quiet cowboy stepped through the saloon doors, his boots clicking against the wood with a sound that somehow cut through all the noise. He was tall, taller than most men in the crowd, and moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years in the saddle. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, not threatening, but present. A reminder. The crowd began to notice him, conversations faltering as his presence registered. Even Jake paused in his torment, looking up at the approaching figure. "You got something to say, stranger?" Jake called out, his voice carrying a tremor of uncertainty. The cowboy said nothing. He just kept walking, his pale eyes fixed on the scene before him. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by experiences that had carved lines of wisdom and pain around his eyes. When he was 10 feet away, he stopped. The entire street fell silent. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight between the cowboy and Jake Morrison, who still held Ayana's hair in his meaty fist. The young Apache woman had gone still, her dark eyes fixed on this stranger who had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer. The cowboy's voice, when it finally came, was quiet as distant thunder. "Let her go." Jake's laugh was nervous now, less certain. "This ain't your business, stranger. We're just teaching this Indian girl some manners." "Let her go," the cowboy repeated, his tone unchanged. There was no anger in his voice, no heat, just an absolute certainty that made the hair on the back of necks stand up. From the crowd, someone whispered, "Who is that?" Sheriff Bradley pushed through the gathered townspeople, his badge catching the light. He was a man who prided himself on keeping the peace, but his version of peace often meant looking the other way when certain people suffered. "Now hold on," Sheriff Bradley said, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "Jake's just having a little fun. No harm done." The cowboy's pale eyes shifted to the sheriff, and something in that gaze made the lawman take a step back. "No harm?" The stranger's voice was soft, but it carried across the street like a whisper in a church. "Look at her." All eyes turned to Ayana. Her traditional dress was torn, her knees bleeding from being dragged across the rough street. Tears of humiliation streaked her dusty cheeks, but her chin remained raised, her dignity intact despite everything. "She's just an Indian," Jake muttered, but his grip on her hair had loosened. The cowboy took a step closer. "She's a person." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the town had convinced itself was true. In the crowd, a few faces showed shame, but most remained hard, set in their prejudices. "You best mind your own business," Jake said, trying to summon his earlier bravado. "This here's a white man's town, and we handle things our way." The cowboy's hand moved to his gun belt, not drawing, just resting there. "Your way stops now." Something in his tone, in the set of his shoulders, told everyone watching that this was not a man who made idle threats. He had the look of someone who had seen violence, who understood its weight and wasn't afraid to carry it if necessary. "Jake," one of his friends whispered urgently, "maybe we should—" "Shut up," Jake snapped, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. The cowboy took another step forward. "I'm going to count to 3. 1. The crowd held its breath. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, shifting restlessly at the hitching posts. 2. Jake's hand trembled where it gripped Ayana's hair. Around them, the town watched in fascination and fear. Some had already begun backing away, sensing that whatever was about to happen, they didn't want to be part of it. 3. The cowboy's gun was in his hand so fast that most people never saw him draw. The barrel pointed steady at Jake's chest, and the young troublemaker found himself staring into the face of his own mortality. "Jesus," someone in the crowd whispered. "Let her go," the cowboy said for the 3rd time, and there was no mistaking the finality in his voice. Jake's hand opened as if burned, and Ayana collapsed to her knees, free but shaking. The cowboy never took his eyes off Jake, but his voice gentled when he spoke to her. "Can you stand?" Ayana nodded, struggling to her feet. Her legs felt weak, but she managed to remain upright. The medicine bag lay forgotten in the dust, its contents scattered and trampled. "Get behind me," the cowboy said softly, and she did, feeling safer than she had in months. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat. "Now, see here, stranger, you can't just—" "Can't what?" The cowboy's eyes found the sheriff's badge. "Can't stop a crime in progress? Can't protect someone who can't protect herself?" The sheriff's face flushed. Jake wasn't doing nothing illegal, just teaching her a lesson. "What lesson?" The cowboy's voice was deadly quiet. "That might makes right? That cruelty is acceptable as long as it's directed at someone different?" Dr. Helen Morrison pushed through the crowd. Jake's own mother, a woman who had spent her life in this town, who had seen it grow from a rough frontier settlement into something resembling civilization. Her face was pale with shame as she looked at her son. "Jacob Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of motherhood, "you will apologize to this young woman, right now." Right now, Jacob," the crowd murmured, sensing the shift in the wind. Jake looked around desperately, but found no support, no allies. Even his friends had backed away, leaving him alone to face the consequences of his actions. Jake's voice cracked. "I'm sorry." Ayanna said nothing, but her dark eyes held a dignity that made several townspeople look away in shame. The cowboy holstered his gun with the same fluid motion he'd drawn it. "Sheriff, I expect you'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Sheriff Bradley nodded reluctantly. "Of course. Jake, you boys get on home now." As the crowd began to disperse, the cowboy knelt and began gathering the scattered contents of Ayanna's medicine bag. His movements were gentle, respectful, as he collected the herbs and roots that represented her heritage and her livelihood. "Thank you," Ayanna said softly, accepting the bag from his weathered hands. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." As the sun set over Copper Ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the stranger and the Apache girl stood in the dusty street. Two outcasts who had found an unexpected moment of understanding in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart. But in a town like Copper Ridge, such moments rarely went unpunished. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the desert mountains. Ayanna had spent the night in the small camp she'd made outside town, beneath a cluster of Joshua trees that provided little shelter from the wind. She had planned to leave at first light, to return to her grandmother's dwelling in the canyon and forget this place existed. But something held her back. Maybe it was the memory of a stranger's kindness, or maybe it was the realization that running away would only prove Jake Morrison right, that she didn't belong in the world beyond the reservation. The cowboy had stayed at the saloon, but sleep had been elusive. He stood now at his window, watching the street below as the town came to life. His real name was Thomas Garrett, though he hadn't spoken it aloud in 3 years. He had been a cavalry officer once, before the weight of orders that went against his conscience had driven him to resign his commission and disappear into the vast emptiness of the frontier. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." The door opened to reveal Dr. Helen Morrison, her face etched with worry and shame. She was a handsome woman in her 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that had seen too much of both the best and worst of humanity. "Mr. she began, then stopped. "I'm afraid I don't know your name." "Garrett," he said quietly. "Thomas Garrett." "Mr. Garrett, I wanted to thank you for what you did yesterday, and to apologize for my son's behavior." Thomas studied her face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Your son made his own choices, ma'am. That's not your burden to carry." "Isn't it?" She moved to the window, looking out at the street where her son had humiliated an innocent girl. "I raised him in this town, with its attitudes and its cruelties. Maybe I didn't do enough to teach him that people are people, regardless of their color or their heritage." "It's not too late," Thomas said, "for him or for this town." Dr. Morrison turned back to him. I'm afraid it might be. There's been talk. Some of the men are saying you made them look weak yesterday, that you sided with an Indian against white folk. They're planning something. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. What kind of something? I don't know exactly, but I heard my son talking to Bill Hutchins and some of the others. They're angry, Mr. Garrett, angry and embarrassed, and that young Apache woman, she's still camped outside town. A day or two, through the window, Thomas could see the smoke from Ayana's small fire rising in the distance. She should have left by now, should have put as many miles as possible between herself and Copper Ridge. But she was still here, and that could only mean trouble. I'll handle it, Thomas said. Be careful, Dr. Morrison warned. This town, it can be a dangerous place for those who don't fit in. After she left, Thomas strapped on his gun belt and headed downstairs. The saloon was nearly empty, just a few early drinkers nursing their whiskey and trying to forget their troubles. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete, watched him with wary eyes. You stirred up quite a hornet's nest yesterday, Pete said, polishing a glass with mechanical precision. Sometimes hornets need stirring, Thomas replied, dropping coins on the bar for his room. Maybe so, but hornets have a way of stinging back. Thomas touched his hat brim in acknowledgement and walked out into the morning air. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of a storm. He could feel eyes watching him from windows and doorways, the weight of a town's disapproval pressing down on him like a physical thing. He found Ayana sitting by her small fire, grinding herbs with a stone mortar and pestle. She looked up as he approached, her dark eyes wary, but not unfriendly. You should have left, he said without preamble. So should you, she replied, continuing her work. But here we both are. Thomas smiled despite himself. You're right about that. He crouched down beside her fire, grateful for its warmth. There's going to be trouble. Some of the men in town are planning, I don't know what, but it won't be good. Ayana nodded, unsurprised. I know. I've been watching them gather. They think because I'm Indian, I can't see or understand their plotting. Then why haven't you left? She was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling in their work. My grandmother always told me that running away from a problem doesn't solve it, it just gives it time to grow stronger. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She died last winter. Ayana's voice was soft with grief. The influenza came through the reservation. The medicine man couldn't help her, and the white doctors, they wouldn't come. Thomas felt a familiar anger burning in his chest, the same anger that had driven him to resign his commission when he'd been ordered to participate in actions that violated everything he believed in. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. She taught me about healing, Ayana continued. Said that sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to open it up and clean out the infection, even if it hurts worse at first. Man, you think this town is infected. I think this whole country is infected, she said, meeting his eyes, with fear, with hatred, with the idea that some people are worth less than others. But infection can be cured if you're willing to do the work. Before Thomas could respond, the sound of horses reached them. He stood, his hand moving instinctively to his gun as 6 riders approached. Jake Morrison led them, his face twisted with anger and embarrassment. Behind him rode Bill Hutchins, the town's most successful rancher, and 4 other men Thomas recognized from the previous day's crowd. Well, Jake called out as they drew near. Look what we got here. The Indian lover and his pet savage having a cozy little chat. Thomas stepped protectively in front of Ayana, his pale eyes fixed on the mounted men. You boys are a long way from town. Not far enough, Bill Hutchins said, his voice carrying the authority of wealth and influence. We came to deliver a message. I'm listening. Jake's horse danced sideways, sensing its rider's agitation. The message is simple, stranger. You got 24 hours to get out of our town, and you take your Indian friend with you. And if I don't? Bill Hutchins leaned forward in his saddle. Then we'll make sure you both disappear. Permanently. The wind picked up, whipping dust between the two groups. Storm clouds were building on the horizon, dark and threatening. Thomas felt the familiar calm that came before violence, the settling of his mind into the clear, deadly focus that had kept him alive through 3 years of frontier warfare. "That sounds like a threat," he said quietly. "It's a promise," Jake snarled. "This is white man's country, and we aim to keep it that way." Thomas looked at each man in turn, memorizing their faces. "I'll be sure to remember that." The riders sat their horses for a moment longer, then wheeled and rode away, leaving dust and tension in their wake. Thomas watched them go, his hand still resting on his gun. 24 hours, Ayanna said quietly. 24 hours, Thomas agreed. "What will you do?" He turned to look at her, this young woman who had more courage than most men he'd known. "I guess that depends on what you're planning to do." Ayanna stood, brushing dust from her torn dress. "I'm going to town. I have business to finish. That's suicide. Maybe, or maybe it's the only way to clean out the infection." She met his eyes, and he saw in them the same determined calm he felt in himself. "My grandmother always said that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it." Thomas nodded slowly. "Your grandmother was definitely a wise woman. Will you stand with me?" He looked toward the town, where smoke rose from chimneys and the business of daily life continued, oblivious to the storm that was coming. Then he looked back at this young Apache woman who refused to be intimidated, who chose to face hatred with dignity and fear with courage. "I'll stand with you," he said. The first drops of rain began to fall, dark spots in the dust that would soon become a torrent. But for now, there was only the promise of the storm, and 2 unlikely allies preparing to face whatever came next. The rain came down in sheets as Thomas and Ayanna rode into Copper Ridge together, her on a borrowed horse from the trading post, him on his faithful sorrel gelding. The storm had transformed the dusty streets into rivers of mud, and the few people brave enough to venture out scurried quickly between buildings, heads down against the driving rain. But word of their arrival spread quickly through the town. By the time they reached the main street, faces were pressed against windows, and more than a few men had gathered in the saloon despite the early hour. Thomas helped Ayanna down from her horse, noting how she winced as her injured knees bent. The medicine bag was slung across her shoulder, its contents carefully organized and protected from the weather. "Where to first?" he asked, having to raise his voice above the storm. "The doctor's office," she said, pointing toward a neat wooden building with a painted sign. "Dr. Morrison, she'll need these supplies." Thomas frowned. "You're delivering medicine to Jake Morrison's mother." "She's been treating the fever that's been going around," Ayanna explained. "These herbs will help reduce the inflammation and ease the pain. People are suffering, Mr. Garrett. It doesn't matter what their sons have done." They walked through the mud toward the doctor's office, aware of the hostile stares following them. The rain had driven most people indoors, but those who remained outside made no effort to hide their displeasure. Dr. Morrison opened the door before they could knock, her face showing both relief and concern. "Come in quickly," she said, ushering them into the warm, antiseptic-scented interior of her practice. "I brought the willow bark extract you requested," Ayanna said, producing a carefully wrapped bundle from her medicine bag. "And some echinacea root. It should help with the fever." Dr. Morrison accepted the herbs with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. We've had 3 more cases since yesterday, and the medicine I ordered from Phoenix won't arrive for another week." "How do you prepare the willow bark?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. Ayanna looked surprised by his interest. You steep it in hot water like tea, but not too hot, or it destroys the healing properties. My grandmother said the tree gives up its medicine willingly if you ask respectfully. Indigenous knowledge, Dr. Morrison said, measuring out portions of the herbs. We could learn so much if we'd only listen. A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Through the rain-streaked window, Thomas could see men gathering in the street despite the weather. Jake Morrison stood in the center of the group, his voice carrying over the sound of the storm. "They're here," he was shouting. "The stranger and the Indian, they came back." "You need to leave," Dr. Morrison said urgently. "Through the back door. I'll delay them." But Thomas was already moving toward the front of the building, his hand resting on his gun. "No more running." "Mr. Garrett, please," Dr. Morrison called after him. "These men are beyond reason." "Then maybe it's time they learned some," Thomas replied, opening the front door and stepping out into the storm. The crowd had grown to nearly 20 men, including Sheriff Bradley, who looked uncomfortable, but made no move to disperse them. Jake Morrison stood at the front, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You had your chance to leave," Jake shouted over the rain. "Now you're both going to pay." Thomas stepped fully into the street, Ayanna beside him. The rain soaked through their clothes within moments, but neither moved to take shelter. "What exactly are we paying for?" Thomas called back. "Treating sick people? Showing basic human decency? For thinking you can come into our town and tell us how to live?" Bill Hutchins emerged from the crowd, his expensive clothes already sodden with rain. "For siding with Indians against white folks? For being better men than you'll ever be?" The voice came from an unexpected source. Dr. Morrison, who had followed them outside despite the danger. "For showing courage when the rest of us showed cowardice," the crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others looking ashamed. But Jake Morrison's rage only intensified. "Shut up, Ma! This doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had delivered half the babies in town and tended the sick for 30 years. "This young woman just brought medicine to help our people. She could have left us to suffer, but she chose to help instead. And you want to punish her for it?" "She's an Indian," Jake snarled. "They ain't our people." "She's a human being," Dr. Morrison shot back. "And so are you, though you seem determined to forget it." Thomas felt the tension in the crowd shifting, uncertainty creeping in where before there had been only anger. He sensed his moment and stepped forward. "I served in the cavalry for 8 years," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the storm. "I fought in battles against Apache, Comanche, and Lakota. I've seen what hatred and fear can do to good people." The crowd grew quieter, straining to hear him over the rain. "I've seen men do terrible things in the name of duty, of civilization, of progress. I've done terrible things myself." Thomas's voice grew heavy with memory. "And I've learned that the only way to stop being a monster is to stop acting like one." "Pretty words," Jake sneered, "but this is still a white man's country." "No," Thomas said firmly, "this is America, and America is supposed to be better than this." Sheriff Bradley finally found his voice. "Now, Thomas, it's Mr. Garrett to you, Sheriff, and I'm not finished." Thomas looked around at the gathered men, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "You want to know why I resigned my commission? Why I left the cavalry?" The crowd was silent now, caught despite themselves by the pain in his voice. "Because I was ordered to participate in a massacre. Women and children mostly. Old men who couldn't fight back, and I watched good soldiers, men I'd served with for years, turn into animals because someone told them it was their duty." The rain continued to fall, washing the dust from the street and creating small rivers that ran between the buildings. Thomas refuses to stand by as fear and hatred consume Copper Ridge. Though met with skepticism, he's soon joined by Dr. Morrison and others in town who step forward to support him and Ayanna. The crowd shifts, not divided by race, but by conscience. The standoff ends when Samuel Hutchins, the town's founder, steps in. With wisdom and humility, he apologizes to Ayanna and commands the aggressors to stand down. Slowly, the hostility dissolves. Exhausted, but relieved, Thomas and Ayanna realize the fight isn't over. But the tide has turned. They agree to stay in town, committed to protecting the vulnerable and ensuring change takes root. As the rain clears and sunlight returns, Ayanna thanks Thomas for seeing her as a person. In her quiet strength, Thomas finds his own redemption. Copper Ridge begins to change, one act of courage at a time.